Mio, Honda, you say, is the stronger of the two players, but are they strong enough to withstand this tariff environment? And can we say the same for the Japanese automakers as a whole?
Well, in terms of Honda, in relative terms, they're in a slightly better position. Toyota and Honda have some of the lowest exposure to imports from Mexico into the US as well as from Canada. So people may not, I mean, this may not be intuitive, but actually, for example, the American Big Three is far more exposed to cross-border imports of vehicles as well as auto parts. And our take on this is actually that it seems a bit unlikely that the tariffs would be allowed to go through just in the headline way that they've been presented, simply because you do often get situations where, for example, auto parts may cross the border several times before actually being installed in the fully manufactured vehicle. So in that case, it would create an extremely large tax burden and mess things up from an administrative perspective as well. I think very few automakers would be able to effectively cope with this. So I do think some flexibility is going to be needed, or it will create a really messy situation. In general, I think the Japanese automakers are a little bit more insulated than the big three, but still nowhere near enough to sort of be able to sail through this cleanly. What we do think, though, is that even if the tariffs don't go through, just simply the fact that this is being brought up and, look like it could happen will probably mean that more production will shift into the US proper, and that localization will continue to be a theme, simply because even if it doesn't actually happen, the risk of it potentially happening in the future will probably push companies to try and de-risk.
You'd have to agree that I think it'd be fair to say that the Japanese car makers are probably least exposed to risk from tariffs on U.S. tariffs on China, right? I mean, most of their offshore manufacturing in this part of the world has been outsourced to, not outsourced, but they built capacity and supply chain in Southeast Asia, yes?
Yes, so the Japanese automakers in general, to one extent or the other, have actually been focused on localizing production for a very long time. Particularly, this actually started after the financial crisis. So they've had almost 2 decades now, and it accelerated a little bit after the earthquake in Tohoku. And there was a little bit of an issue with Renesas and some electronics and being a little bit too dependent on them. So they've generally been moving in this direction for a very long time. And so to a large extent, they're already relatively prepared. And as you mentioned, the Asian production base for export is much more ASEAN focused than China focused. So they really shouldn't have too much of an issue with the tariffs from China. The North American tariffs are what would potentially present an issue for them.